Ever since the first books came out, Tywin Lannister has been a greatly discussed character in the Song of Ice and Fire. The traditional view of him has been that he is a highly competent, pragmatic and skillful ruler who single-handedly raised House Lannister to national power through his intelligence and strength. This has led some people to view Tywin as a genius and even declare that he solved Westeros. This has been the mainstream traditional view of the character, especially since Charles Dance portrayed him excellently in the TV show. However, in recent years, particularly amongst the more hardcore elements of the fandom, there have been shifting views when it comes to Tywin Lannister, with many fans now taking a more critical view of him, with some going as far as to consider him pretty dumb, insecure and stupid, and they suggest the rise of House Lannister was the result of luck rather than Tywin's skill. Today, let's examine the character in greater detail and weigh up both sides of the argument. Is Tywin a genius player of 5D chess, or was he overrated and stupid? Well, first let's start with the facts. Tywin's father Tytos was a joke. He was very weak and let his bannermen walk over him, to the point where several were literally joining his control to join the Reach, and he was letting them. Everybody owed him money, and he never demanded repayment. His bannermen were practically spitting in his face. Kindness is a virtue in a ruler, but Tytos took it to such an extreme that he made himself and House Lannister into a joke. So it fell upon Tywin to restore the Lannister name, and he set about it in his usual brutal way. He destroyed the rebellious Tarbecks and Rains by wiping out their entire lines. This, combined with the Red Wedding, are typically seen by fans as ruthless, super-intelligent moves that ensured Tywin gained respect and inspired fear, as well as eliminated his enemies. However, in recent times, some have begun to question the brutality of his methods. These revisionists argue that Tywin's methods, wiping out entire noble families, were so brutal they would inspire not just respect and fear, but deep resentment and mistrust from other, lesser houses. Perhaps his neighbours would grow worried and seek to stop him before he turned against them. Surely such brutality would inspire dissent and revolt. So, according to the revisionists, Tywin was acting very stupidly by doing this. However, whilst it would potentially lead to dissent and rebellion today, we have to consider these actions within their medieval context. To look at comparative examples of brutality from real medieval history could give us clues about how Tywin's actions would have been received. First, let's examine the Black Dinner, the inspiration behind the Red Wedding. In the Black Dinner, the young Earl of Douglas and his brother were invited to dine with the 10-year-old Scottish king to make peace with the crown. However, the two young men were ambushed by the Regent of Scotland, and, despite the young king crying and begging for mercy, the two young noblemen were slaughtered. So, what do you think happened to the Regent? He betrayed hospitality rules and murdered two powerful noblemen in front of the king, who was weeping and begging for the massacre to stop. Surely the Regent would have been despised by everyone, and when the traumatized king reached maturity, the Regent would have been ruined or worse. Well, no. Instead, he continued to rise higher, remaining regent for many years and gaining greater power. Far from being punished, he was rewarded by the noblemen. Another similar incident occurred in Bohemia in 995 AD. Two noble families, the Přemyslids and the Slavniks, were vying for control of the realm. Suddenly and without warning, the Přemyslids attacked the Slavniks in their home and massacred them. What happened to the Přemyslids? Well, they gained power over Bohemia and ruled the country for centuries. Obviously, these actions were morally wrong. I follow Christ, and I am totally against these brutal actions. But these real-life events show that far from backfiring, brutal methods often resulted in long-term earthly success for the perpetrators. Given this, the lack of revolt or rebellion against Tywin's brutality doesn't seem so strange in a medieval context. The second reason that is usually given for why Tywin is overrated: within a year or two of his death, his legacy was crumbling. So does that show that Tywin failed? Well, not really. Upon Tywin's death, the kingdom was essentially united under the rule of young King Tommen. The Boltons were establishing themselves in the north, the Riverlands had been subdued, the Stormlands pacified, and most importantly the Reach had been brought to House Lannister's side. The marriage between Tommen and Marjorie was Tywin's masterstroke. The Tyrells are the single most powerful house, with 100,000 men supposedly under their command in the Reach. The Reach is likewise highly fertile and populous. There is no reason why a monarchy built upon the twin pillars of Lannister and Tyrell couldn't last for decades or longer. Now, it so happened that after Tywin's death, his useless son Jaime and his useless daughter were left in charge, and they proceeded to mess things up. But this isn't Tywin's fault. His idiot son and heir Jaime behaved terribly his entire life, even going so far as to join the Kingsguard and renounce his inheritance so he could have relations with his sister. What is Tywin supposed to do about that? Perhaps Tywin was too hard, even with his favourite son, and this pushed him into the arms of his sister. But their relationship began when they were young, and whilst their loving mother was still around, and Tywin was at his happiest. I don't think it's unfair to say that both Jaime and his sister were simply rotten from birth. But Tywin did have a second son, Tyrion, and it's here that the arguments of the revisionists begin to hold weight. First, let's see Tywin's second biggest mistake that is, and that was his sack of King's Landing. During Robert's rebellion, Tywin sat by and waited for a clear victor to emerge before throwing himself in with Robert. So, when he arrived at King's Landing with his army, his real intention was to take the city and the Mad King into his control. However, his man Pycelle convinced the Mad King to let Tywin into the city, which he did. Now, Tywin's forces had bloodlessly entered the city. The smart move would have been to march right up to the Red Keep and enter as a friend, then turn against the king and capture him. Instead, however, Tywin let his men run rampage through the city, looting and killing. This was a stupid move. It earned him and the Lannisters the enmity of the people, a hatred so strong it is referenced in the books, which are set years later. And when your daughter and grandsons live and rule in King's Landing, it makes no sense to so severely damage your relationship with the people there. Secondly, Jaime was still in the Kingsguard and by the Mad King's side, so by immediately sacking the city, Tywin risked the Mad King executing his son and heir. For some reason this didn't happen, and Tywin can count himself lucky it didn't. This brings us to Tywin's biggest failure, his treatment of his son Tyrion. Tywin loved his wife, and when she died giving birth to Tyrion he was devastated. And when the boy turned out to be a dwarf, the child his wife died to make, he became enraged and hated the child his entire life. This is clearly wrong. Tyrion didn't choose to kill his mother, and it is an example of the supposedly cold, pragmatic Tywin letting his irrational emotions stop him from realizing that Tyrion was the cleverest of his children, and the best.